Sanctify them in the truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world. And for their sake, I consecrate myself, that they also may be sanctified in truth.
Welcome back. Thank you for joining me in another video here at Sanctified in Truth. Today, as I alluded to in the first intro video, we are going to be talking about 5 of Plato's dialogues today. The 5 being Euthyphro, Plato's Apology, Crito, I don't know how to pronounce that, Meno, and then we're going to finish on Phaedo. So those are the 5 that we're going over. Before I jump into it, I just want to maybe talk a little bit about who Plato is. I don't want to go too in depth. Essentially, for what's important though, is that Plato is a pre-Christ figure. Pre-incarnation figure. So he lives between 400 to 300 BC. So that would be 300 to 400 years before the birth of Christ. Plato is the writer of these dialogues, but the dialogues center around Socrates, who most believe to be his teacher. So these dialogues have him as the central character, and he's the one that's actually dialoguing with others. Plato makes no mention of himself in these dialogues. So we're gonna talk a little bit about that and their emphasis, Plato's emphasis on truth and virtue, and a lot of different topics in here. And as I had mentioned in the first video, I think that this is a very fascinating and interesting subject, and I'm covering it on this channel because I do think that Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, all are non-Christian historical figures that had significant impact on Christendom. I think for those that are deep in theology or even philosophy know that a lot of Christian terms or ways of defining things or explaining things are done in like Aristotelian ways from Aristotle. So, but that aside, their morality and their focus on a lot of virtue is something that may or may not have, I think it has, paved the way, or not paved the way, but prepared the pagan world for Christ to make Christianity maybe more palatable to the Greeks or Romans. A couple of disclaimers before we get in. This is not going to be an overview. You've probably seen the length of the video when you clicked on it. I don't know how long it is at the time of this second, but it's going to be relatively in-depth. We're going to try to cover major themes along with what the actual chronology and timeline and the story of it is, the plot of these dialogues, how they apply to the Christian, maybe areas we might agree or disagree. All that to say, it will be more of a deep dive dissection into these 5 dialogues. The other thing that I want to talk about is the idea in general about finding sanctifying themes in non-Christian works. I can foresee potentially people wondering why we would be covering this in a channel that wants to explore truth in a way that leads to spiritual growth, because Plato nor Socrates were self-proclaimed Christians or even Jews, because they're pre-Christ. They're not even like in Israel. So it's like someone might ask, well, why? Why would we cover it? And I think that what's important to first lay the groundwork on this is that I think we have to hold the belief that some truths, some godly truths, can be found in non-Christian figures. And I think inherently we kind of know that already when we meet people that aren't Christians but still kind of come off as good people. And I think that Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, these are figures that while they definitely did not have all the right answers, and nor is their outlook on life and eternity even fully encompassing the Christian one, but there are things in their search for truth and for a virtuous life that have led them to real truths that we can look at as Christians and say, that's something that I can learn from. And while these truths may also be found in the Bible, it just gives us another perspective of someone else saying these and kind of, just teaching us from another point of view. And for those that might wonder, well, where do you get this idea that non-Christians can come to truth or have morality? I would say read maybe the first handful of chapters of Romans. It talks about the law being written on people's hearts, and that people that maybe don't know God still have the ability to act in a godly manner to some degree. Obviously, I don't want to get on this. It's heavily debated what degree of good can be done for someone that is not doing good for the sake of God or Christ, but I don't want to get on that topic. I just want to say we can find truth outside of the Bible, not to say that it trumps the Bible or that it's not already contained in the Bible, but certainly people can come to truth without what we would call special revelation, meaning like the Bible. There's natural ways to come to truth. I think we can all understand that. I'm going to give this warning to anyone to whom it might be relevant. We are going to briefly touch on suicide because it is mentioned in the last dialogue, Phaedo. I don't intend to get graphic or anything like that, but for some people that is a sensitive subject, just be aware. And then before I get into Euthyphro, the first one, I want to talk about what I think is just a very interesting story about Plato to begin with. Within the realm of Christian history and tradition, this is not exactly 100% true. We don't know. It's kind of like just a story that is told and has been preserved to some degree in Christian circles or through the histories. But I believe it's in like the 6th or 7th century. We find he's an abbot, and he has this disdain for these philosophers, particularly Plato. He doesn't like them. And the story goes is that he's cursing Plato and some of these other philosophers every night before he goes to bed, essentially as he's talking to God. And as legend has it, he's actually visited by Plato in a dream, where Plato says, "Man, stop cursing me, you merely harm yourself. I do not deny that I was a sinner, but when Christ descended into Hades to preach the gospel, no one believed in him sooner than I did." And again, I don't know that this is 100% true, but I just think it goes to show that Christian history has recognized the impact that Plato and all these other philosophers not only had on the Christian faith in terms of defining things, but also that they actually had real truth that they came to. And in this instance, there's a doctrine called the harrowing of Hades, in which Christ, when he goes down, most traditions have this doctrine, Eastern Orthodox, Catholic, even some Protestants, that when Christ descends into Hades, he preaches the gospel to everyone there and sets the captives free, brings them out. And this is part of him conquering Satan and death and the grave and whatnot. But I just think it's a really interesting story. And then there's also some other earlier Christian writings. Justin Martyr comes to mind as one who is particularly fond of these early philosophers, again, not in the sense that they are at the same level of scripture or whatnot, but just that there was actual real truths that they came to, and maybe had they had the opportunity to know Christ in life, they would have been Christians themselves. So with that being said, I don't want to waste any more time on the intro. We're going to get into Euthyphro. So Euthyphro, like I said, this is the first dialogue in the series, and at least as it seems to me, this is chronologically the first two. It wasn't just put in a random order. I would say the main theme of this dialogue is virtue, and trying to understand what is virtue, what is the essence of virtue. So it takes place outside a courthouse, and we find out Socrates is at this courthouse because he's being put on trial. Essentially, he's been summoned to stand before judges, and he's accused mainly of corrupting the youth. We don't get a lot of other details in this dialogue, but he meets a man there named Euthyphro, and Euthyphro is there for kind of the opposite reason. He's actually bringing a charge against someone else. In this case, it's his father. So basically what happens is Euthyphro is telling the story that he's there because his father killed somebody. And how it went is his father had witnessed two people fighting. One man kills the other. So Euthyphro's father essentially digs a ditch, puts the man in the ditch, and kind of tells him he's got to stay there until he finds someone to try him or whatnot. The man dies in the ditch, though. So we find out that Euthyphro is essentially bringing him to the judges for that reason. And at least me, when I'm reading this initially, I'm under the impression that Euthyphro is a guy that has a pretty strong moral compass. I think we can imagine how difficult it would be to proactively put somebody on trial or bring to court that we're close with, especially a family member, a father figure. And as he's explaining this and saying that he's doing this kind of because he understands what virtue and piety is, like I said, you get this sense that he's kind of the good guy already. Socrates, after hearing this, kind of gets excited, and you don't really know his games by now, but he initially is like, wow, you must really know what virtue is to do something like this. And Euthyphro basically says yes. He's like, yeah, I do. I know about this stuff. And Plato asks him, please tell me, what is virtue? And I'm going to give you the quote. Euthyphro says, sorry, before I give you the quote, I should say I'm interchanging virtue and piety. They refer to it as piety in this, but piety, virtue, morality, whatever you want to call it, is kind of the same thing. Euthyphro says, piety is doing as I am doing. That is to say, prosecuting anyone who is guilty of murder, sacrilege, or of any similar crime, whether he be your father or mother, or whoever he may be. That makes no difference. And not to prosecute them is impiety. So again, we can see the strong moral compass. We can see that he's saying, do the right thing, no matter who it is, no matter the situation, and to not do this thing is wrong. It's impious. But Socrates has an issue with this, not so much that we shouldn't be doing the right thing. So it's not that he's disagreeing from a moral standpoint. He's just upset more or disagreeing more because it doesn't really answer the question. Euthyphro doesn't define what piety or virtue is, but instead he just gives an example. To kind of understand what he's saying, it'd be like you want to know, what is a car? So you ask me, hey, Johnny, what's a car? And I said, well, a Toyota is a car. A Honda Civic is a car. And you're like, yeah, but that doesn't really tell me what a car is in essence. The same is true with Socrates. Is he's wondering, I need an actual definition. That's what I was looking for. Euthyphro eventually responds and says, well, then piety is what is dear to the gods, while impiety is that which is not dear to them. So he's kind of giving a definition of like, if the gods like it and it matters to them, then piety, it's virtuous. If not, then it's not. And they have a little back and forth on this issue for a few reasons. One being, well, again, this is ancient Greece. They have a pantheon of gods. And Socrates is like, okay, well, how is this going to work? Because I think we can both agree that the gods don't all agree on the same things. And he gives an instance. Zeus brings charges and is basically upset with his father Kronos because Kronos does some despicable thing. I want to say he eats his children or something like that. I don't remember offhand, but he does something horrible. And it's like, okay, well, obviously Kronos thinks that was okay to do. And Zeus disagreed. So in that case, which action is pious or right or virtuous or not? This is all summed up by Socrates, and he says, then, my friend, I remark with surprise that you have not answered the question which I asked. For I certainly did not ask you to tell me what action is both pious and impious, but now it would seem that what is loved by the gods is also hated by them. And therefore, Euthyphro, in thus chastising your father, you may very likely be doing what is agreeable to Zeus, but disagreeable to Kronos or Uranus, and what is acceptable to Hephaestus but unacceptable to Hera. And there may be other gods who have similar differences of opinion. So he's saying, okay, this doesn't actually get me any closer because it's all relative now. I still am not any further along. I'm still confused. He then asks Euthyphro another pretty important question. And this is kind of the crux of this Euthyphro dialogue. And that is something pious because the gods love it? Or is it loved by the gods because it is pious? This is a question of origin. It's kind of a trap because option one has some concerns. That being, is it pious because the gods love it? And the first difficulty in that is what we've already mentioned, that the gods differ in what they love and they hate. And the other is that it seems arbitrary. Once you say, well, because the gods love it, that's why it's pious, then you'd have to ask, well, on what basis do they love it? Because that would be the true answer, not that the gods love it. It'd be whatever basis the gods love it on. And if the answer is, well, there is no basis, then it's just arbitrary. And whatever the gods, virtue is essentially just whatever the gods randomly decided was pious. Option 2, the other one, it being loved by the gods because it's already pious, again, doesn't define piety. It removes the definition away from the gods and puts it elsewhere, because it's not really then the gods that decide what's pious. They are just maybe the ones that recognize it first, but something else outside of both the power of the gods and maybe even their knowledge is what's making these actions virtuous or pious, not the gods themselves. They're just, like I said, kind of the first person to recognize, oh, these are the pious things, we're going to try to do them. This is kind of the focal point of the argument, and it never really gets truly answered. And I want to interject in here with Christian thought. And I think that this is important because in the world now, while we don't normally deal with people that believe in a pantheon of gods, we do deal with a lot of people that think virtue and morality and all these other things are subjective or relative. And instead of pawning it to gods and saying, well, they decide, everyone is just their own god that gets to decide what is or is not pious. And it's just relative. And I think that we can recognize the similarities, but Christianity does have a real answer. And people that are familiar with apologetics know that for a lot of people, the moral argument is a very strong one. And that argument being that if you want absolute truths and standards, you need it grounded in something that is also absolute and that is unchanging. There needs to be something real there that is holding these definitions in place. And for Christians, the answer to Socrates' question of, do the gods love it because it's pious, or is it pious because the gods love it, is neither. God, in and of himself, is virtue and piety and righteousness. And so it is his character that we see when other people are being virtuous. So why does God love it when we are righteous or virtuous or pious or whatever you want to say? Well, it's not because he's arbitrarily picked some random things like, oh, love is a good thing today, and so I'm deciding, when he created all things. He wasn't like, well, I like love, and, well, maybe telling the truth will be fine. These are things that are grounded in God's character and therefore in his essence, which means they are eternal things, not outside of God, and they don't get their definition from something else, but they also aren't ever changing because God is also never changing. So we can ground virtue and piety in God's essence. And so God likes or loves seeing us be pious or act virtuously, not arbitrarily, but because when we do that, we kind of mirror God's own character. And so he sees himself in us, I think, when we act in these ways. So that sums up Euthyphro, and that's kind of the crux of the argument, and it really just ends kind of anticlimactically in that Euthyphro kind of hears all this out, and they have some back and forth, and he's just like, okay, great, I have to go though, so see ya. And that's how Euthyphro ends. So now we're going to tackle Plato's Apology, or Socrates' Apology, really. In Plato's Apology, which is really Socrates' Apology, the main themes are wisdom and humility, good versus evil, and the state of the soul. These are the things that are talked about most. And right off the bat, I want to explain why this is called apology. It's not an apology because Socrates is about to say, I'm sorry, but it actually comes from the word apologia, apologia, I might be mispronouncing that, which really just means to defend. So in this one, Socrates is going to be mounting his defense and defending against the claims of both corrupting the youth, and then there's also a smaller, well, I don't know if it's smaller in severity, but it's just not talked about as much, and that is not believing in God or the God. So it's almost a charge of atheism against him. As I said, the major charge is corrupting the youth. He very briefly combats the idea that he doesn't believe in gods. It's kind of silly. They're kind of like, the guy that's bringing this charge, this interlocutor, is like, okay, you believe in spiritual things, but you don't believe in the gods. And Socrates is like, okay, that doesn't make sense. So you're saying I believe in spiritual things, which would imply I believe in spirits, yeah? And he's like, oh, yeah. And he's like, Are spirits not just divine beings and basically gods? Like, that's just kind of how that ends. To me, it seemed kind of like, okay, yeah, that's a little goofy. So he kind of squashes that. It's not like the first thing he addresses, but since it's so small, I just want to kind of get that out of the way. The majority of the time is spent against the charge of corrupting the youth. And he's in this back and forth with his interlocutor, and he gets him to essentially show bias or hatred against Socrates individually, because through some back and forth and some questions, he kind of gets him to admit that Socrates is the only person in the city that's corrupting the youth, which is obviously silly. And his next question that Socrates asks him is, okay, am I doing this on purpose, or is this an accidental corrupting of the youth? Because if it's on purpose, then yeah, these charges are warranted. But if it's on accident, then maybe I should just need to be, I need to be re-educated, or maybe I just need to be shown the error of my way, something like that. But his interlocutor says, no, it's on purpose. And they go back and forth more, and it comes down to Socrates saying, well, this is ridiculous. If I'm corrupting the youth on purpose, which is really only serving the purpose of making them evil or bad people, I would be harming myself, because I would be making bad people all around me, and bad people do bad things to other people. So I would be, maybe I would hurt other people too, but I would be the one hurt too. It's like, if you're teaching the kid that is across from you to throw baseball bats through windows, it's like, yeah, you're intentionally doing bad things, but it's a really dumb idea, because eventually he's going to throw one through yours. And that's kind of the like gist of what he's saying. So he lays all this out, but he also wants to explain, like, why is it that these charges are brought against me? I think anytime when you have enough people that say something against you, you do have to address the objection of, all right, if you're saying they're not true, why is everyone saying it about you then? And that's what he does. And he does this by telling a story. He has a reputation of being wise, and Socrates has a friend that wants to know, is anyone wiser than Socrates? So he goes to an oracle of Delphi. So an oracle is just like a religious, spiritual person that is able to communicate the gods' will and thoughts and words through them to someone else. You could think of him almost like a prophet. Essentially, he consults an oracle, and the oracle, speaking on behalf of the god, says, no, there's no one wiser than Socrates. And Socrates thinks that this is ridiculous. He's like, that's just not the case. There's no way that I can be the wisest person. And so he goes out, and kind of his like life mission now is to prove this god wrong. So he's going to all the wise, the people of reputation that are wise in the city. He's asking them questions, and to his annoyance, he finds that they're just all kind of dumb, and they don't really know anything. And he comes to a conclusion that he is better off than them, because while he doesn't know anything, these are his words, and the other person doesn't know anything, at least he knows that he doesn't know anything. And he's doing this, and he's going around, and he's kind of making it his goal to like now talk to all these people that are supposedly smart and prove that they're not. And so he makes a lot of enemies along the way. He gets a gathering of particularly young people that are listening and watching in on all this, and this is why he's accused of corrupting the youth. But he just goes to show that he's made a fair amount of enemies, not doing anything corrupting per se, but just showing that people are not as smart as they think they are, especially people that are charging money to teach others, only to be proven kind of dumb. And he quotes saying, although I do not suppose that either of us know anything really beautiful and good, I am better off than he is, for he knows nothing and thinks that he knows. I neither know nor think that I know. And again, that kind of sums up where his head is at with how wise people are in general. He goes on to say, I found that the men most in repute were all but the most foolish, and that others less esteemed than they were really wiser and better. But the truth is, O men of Athens, that God only is wise, and by his answer he intends to show that the wisdom of men is worth little or nothing. He is not speaking of Socrates, He's only using my name by way of illustration, as if he said, he, O men, is the wisest, who, like Socrates, knows that his wisdom is in truth worth nothing. And so what he concludes is that through the oracle, the God isn't necessarily saying Socrates as an individual is the wisest person, but that it is people that understand the limitations of their knowledge truly that are wise. So even after all this, the court still finds him guilty, and they're trying to decide on a punishment, and there's some back and forth about whether or not he'd be fined or exiled or put to death. And they seem to not be overly keen on putting him to death. I think they want to exile him. And he said, well, maybe you could just fine me. But the problem is that they want it under one stipulation. One thing is that they want him to stop philosophizing. They want him to stop doing whatever it is that he's doing. Well, this is where Socrates draws the line. He just says, that's not going to happen. He says, men of Athens, I honor and love you, but I shall obey God rather than you. And while I have life and strength, I shall never cease from the practice of teaching of philosophy, exhorting anyone whom I meet and saying to him after my manner, you, my friend, a citizen of the great and mighty and wise city of Athens, are you not ashamed of heaping up the greatest amount of money and honor and reputation and caring so little about wisdom and truth and the greatest improvement of the soul, which you never regard or heed at all? Some of these words in here are almost verbatim for things that you can find in the New Testament. Particularly what sticks out is in Acts. John and Peter are standing before the Jewish people to heal a man, and then in the name of Jesus they heal him. And they're standing before like a Jewish, I don't know if it's a council, I don't know if it's that formal, but it's in front of a Jewish group of people that are essentially telling him that he can't do that anymore. And Peter and John answered and said to him, whether it is right in the sight of God to give heed to you rather than to God, you be the judge, for we cannot stop speaking about what we have seen and heard. And then later in the next chapter, in their conclusion, they said, but Peter and the apostle answers the Jewish people, the Jewish leaders, and say, we must obey God rather than men. And again, this is this idea that there is a time for people that are virtuous to say, we do follow laws and we listen to authority figures, but there is a time when the line is drawn, and that line is drawn when what the men say contradict what it is that God says. And even though Plato isn't saying this in a Christian setting, he's saying the same thing. He's saying at some point, those that are virtuous and really understand what is important are going to have to make a decision whether or not they're going to listen to what God is telling them to do or whether they're going to cave to whoever. There's a time in which we need to draw the line, and we need to understand that regardless of the outcome, we have to obey God. Now, Socrates he talks about this for a little bit, saying, evil is not worth doing to get out of other evil. And in this sentence, or in this context, he's saying that because he feels God has called him, the God's God, whatever you want to say, has called him to do this as his mission. And so it would be wrong of him to do it. And whatever temporal punishment could be suffered is nothing compared to what would both weigh on his soul and be there for him in eternity should he not listen. He says, for neither in war nor yet at law ought I or any man to use every way of escaping death. The difficulty, my friends, is not to avoid death, but to avoid unrighteousness, for that runs faster than death. You don't have to take a leap to understand how these themes can be seen in a Christian way. We need to focus on righteousness, not easing our life, not avoiding death, not getting monetary things, heaping up wealth and heaping up fame, reputation, whatever it is, at the expense of not pursuing the wisdom that comes from the fear of the Lord, truth, virtue. All these things are far more important than being rich. He's not afraid of death. That is something that's really clear. But he sees death as only one of two things. After we die, he thinks your options are either basically an eternal slumber in which you're in a dreamless sleep. The other option is that we go to an afterlife that is decided by how we live our actual life. And to Socrates, both are better than living. There's one more quote that I wanted to read from this section because I think it's particularly easy to connect to biblical figures. kind of at the end of this, he's mourning what is happening to the state of Athens a little bit, and he's worried about it in a way because they're condemning him to death. He says, "For if you kill me, you will not easily find a successor to me, who, if I may use such a ludicrous figure of speech, am sort of a gadfly given to the state by God, and the state is a great and noble steed who is tardy in his motions owing to his very size, and requires to be stirred into life. I am that gadfly which God has attached to the state, and all day long and in all places I am always fastening upon you, arousing and persuading and reproaching you. You will not easily find another like me, and therefore I would advise you to spare me. I dare say that you may feel out of temper, like a person who is suddenly awakened from sleep, and you think that you might easily strike me dead, as Antius advises, and then you would sleep on for the remainder of your lives, unless God in his care of you sent you another gadfly." Super reminiscent of the Old Testament prophets. This is essentially what their role is to Israel, is they come in, and sure, they operated in miracles sometimes and some degree of power, but a lot of what being a prophet was being that, I don't want to say pestering in a negative way because they were obviously great people, but just annoying and pestering the state of Israel into repentance, saying, you need to repent, you need to repent, you're doing wrong, bad things are going to happen if you don't turn away and turn back to the Lord. And he sees himself in a similar function, that he is trying to recall the city either back or to virtuous living again. And while the gadfly is annoying, and they're probably going to kill him just as all the Jews killed the prophets, all the Israelites killed the prophets, it would be a bad thing, because only if God really cares about them would he send him another gadfly. It is like a necessary annoyance that shakes the state into moving forward in a virtuous and healthy manner. So the next one that we're going to get into is Crito or Crito. The main themes of this one in my eyes are the irrelevance of popular opinion and the fact that evil is never permissible. After the trial, he is sentenced to death. Socrates is. So the setting takes place in the prison, and he's got some people that are friends of his that are trying to break him out. They feel like he owes it to his family, his friends, the city, whatever. They're given all the reasons, and he just won't do it. Crito then appeals to popular opinion, saying that most people would be understanding, or it would fit the morality of most people to escape the prison, to live on, continue philosophizing, be there for his family, raise his kids, so on and so forth. But Socrates kind of cuts it off at the legs and is like, the popular opinion, what does that mean to me? It should be the wise, the few wise, that we should care what their opinion is. He says, then, my friend, we must not regard what the many say of us, but what he, the one man who has understanding of just and unjust, will say, and what the truth will say. At this point here being, following bad advice or doing evil is dangerous. It hurts our soul, and it leads to a life not worth living. He's quoted saying, not life, but a good life is to be chiefly valued. Now, I want to read, this is going to be kind of a longer portion of it, longer quote from what I have been doing already, but I want to read it because it really captures a lot of the important parts here. There's a dialogue about when it is right to do evil. It comes out, like I said, in the context of him breaking out of prison. His friends want him to, his family wants him to. Socrates is against it. And the reason he's against it is because his view is that it is unlawful. It would be against the laws of the city to break out of prison. And he has no right to complain about being put there unjustly, because in his eyes, he chose to live in the city. He knew the laws when he was there. He could have left at any time. He has benefited from Athens. He loves the city. I think they even say, of all people, he never left. He never went anywhere. He stayed in Athens basically his whole life. He's not willing to do an evil to prevent another evil. So I'm going to read this quote. Are we to say that we are never intentionally to do wrong, or that in one way we ought, in another way we ought not do wrong? Or is doing wrong always evil and dishonorable, as I was just now saying? And as has been already acknowledged by us, are all our former admissions which were made within the last few days to be thrown away? And have we at our age been earnestly discoursing with one another all our lives, only to discover that we are no better than children? Or in spite of the opinion of the many, and in spite of consequences, whether better or worse, shall we insist on the truth of what was then said, that injustice is always an evil and dishonor to him who acts unjustly? Shall we say so or not? Crito says, yes. Socrates says, then we must do no wrong. Crito says, certainly. Socrates then says, nor when injured, injure in return, as the many imagine, for we must injure no one at all. Clearly not, says Crito. And Socrates says, again, Crito, may we do evil? Surely not, Socrates. And what of doing evil in return for evil, which is the morality of the many? Is that just or not? Crito says, not just. Socrates says, for doing evil to another is the same as injuring them? Very true. And Socrates concludes, then we ought not to retaliate or render evil for evil to anyone, whatever evil we may have suffered from him. But I would have you consider, Crito, whether you really mean what you are saying, for this opinion has never been held and never will be held by any considerable number of persons, and those who are agreed and those who are not agreed upon this point have no common ground, and can only despise one another when they see how widely they differ. Tell me then, whether you agree with and assent to my first principle, that neither injury nor retaliation nor warding off of evil by evil is ever right. And shall that be the premise of our argument, or do you decline and dissent from this? So, and Crito agrees. But basically what he's saying is, I just want to make sure we lay this out before we get too far. Is it ever okay to do evil? Ever? He says no, but he runs them through the whole thing. What if someone hurts you? No. What if someone did evil to you first? No. What if you're doing evil to ward off an even greater evil? The answer is still no. This to me is so important. I think for people that know me personally and outside of this channel, they know that this is a topic that I've been harping on for quite a bit of time, because I think it's a topic that is kind of neglected in modern Christian thought. It's a little bit surprising because a lot of Christian tradition, Catholics, Orthodox, some Protestants, do have doctrinal verbiage for this belief that it's never okay to do evil. It's not okay to side with evil, to do evil to reduce other evil. It's not okay to lie, steal, cheat in order to cause good by it. And I don't want to harp too long on this. What my goal is, like I said in the other videos, is to learn in a manner that maybe causes us to become sanctified. I want us to think, what is my authority for when it is okay to do right and wrong? Particularly when is it okay to do wrong? Do I have an internal rule that as long as it vastly outweighs the bad, that it's okay? That if it brings a good outcome, that it's vastly better than whatever small evil I have to do. So I want us to ask, what is our rule that we have for that if we do have an allowance for evil? And then who decides that rule? And on what basis did you decide it if it's you? Who is our ultimate authority in this matter? And what kind of slippery slope can that lead us to? So I just want us to be thinking about that. And that's really the end of Crito and all the important things I wanted to talk about in it. So we'll move on to Meno now. In many ways, this is going to be a pretty similar dialogue to Euthyphro, and that a huge amount of it is spent on virtue or piety, whatever you would like to call it. Another theme besides virtue would be the immortality of the soul. There's a good amount of discussion on that in this dialogue, but I want to just jump in. This is, again, post-trial, and he is dialoguing with some people about virtue, and it's asked him, can virtue be taught? And again, as I've mentioned in Euthyphro, sometimes Socrates, I feel like he likes to play games, and he kind of, you ask him a question and you think he's going to answer it, but he just goes right back and says, how should I know? I don't even know what virtue is. And so he kind of gets back on the same line of discussion that he has in Euthyphro, where he asks him what it is, and then the guy, instead of giving the essence of it, he just gives him an example. He explains that that's simply an example and not the essence of it. And the guy then offers up a definition given by a poet, and that is, virtue is the desire of things honorable and the power of attaining them. And Socrates has some immediate issue with this. Don't all people desire honorable and good things, especially for themselves? What if a thief has a desire for food and has the means to attain it by stealing? Is that something that is virtuous? Well, of course not. So he picks it apart, and after talking about it for a little bit, they kind of push it to the side and they go into issues on the soul, specifically the immortality of the soul. And this was very interesting to me. Plato, through Socrates, brings up this idea that, at least, I don't think he says this specifically, but he kind of alludes to it, at least in matters of like truth, philosophy, wisdom, we don't learn things, we recall them. And he proves this by bringing this, Meno has like an attendant or a servant. I mean, it's kind of implied that he's a servant of some type. And he's untaught. He's never really had any formal training. And Socrates, with like a stick, he's drawing stuff in the dirt. He teaches him some like basic geometry. And when I say teaches, I don't mean it in the sense of like he lectures him on it. By asking him specific questions, he almost allows the servant to teach himself. Right? He allows him to recall geometry, although he's never learned it. And so he uses this to say, if you're recalling things, you have to have had knowledge from somewhere else. And he uses that to say that there is pre-existence and immortality of the soul. So it's not only that your soul never dies, but it's existed before you. And that's why you're able to, when you're asked questions in certain ways, you're able to recall answers without somebody spoon-feeding it to you. This, to me, is a very interesting topic that I never have really broached sufficiently. It's on the question of pre-existence of the soul, and there is some early church fathers who were condemned for this belief. I could be wrong. I do think that some people dispute this, but Origen being one of them. But it's a very interesting topic to me because it is not an orthodox belief. And what I mean by that, I don't mean Eastern Orthodox. I mean lowercase orthodox, as in it is not a normal Christian belief, nor is it really an acceptable one in most circles to believe that your soul has existed beforehand. The classical Christian belief is that the soul is kind of formed as God creates your body. And it's all in one kind of event. But it's really interesting to me because, and I don't want to get too off the rails on this because I understand that maybe some people aren't as in these conversations as others. But if you are somebody that's really into theology and have been poking around these circles a lot, you may be aware of a term called original guilt. What that is, it's the belief that when Adam fell, and the human race fell, it's not just that we inherited the proclivity to sin and what's deemed a sin nature, but that we also inherited guilt. So we are born guilty before God. Now, I'm not going to make a claim for whether or not I believe that's right or wrong. It's pretty standard in Orthodox, actually. Catholics teach it. A lot of Protestants do. There are, I probably shouldn't speak on the Orthodox because I'll upset people either way. I will say some people do in the Eastern Orthodox, some don't. And most Protestants affirm to some version of original guilt as well. But all that to say, I've always thought that they're kind of connected in a way, in that it seems like if you're going to be held guilty for something, that you should have been there for it. So a lot of people might disagree with that, and I'm sure there's ways out. And like I said, I have not broached the subject and really studied it enough to really speak intelligibly on it. But it's just super interesting to me to think that that is a doctrine denied, the preexistence of the soul, when it seems to fit so well with one that is so popular, and that being original guilt. And you would think that, well, if all the souls were there at the time of, and maybe active in some way, at the time of the fall, that we all our souls at one time fell with Adam, and then that's why we're killed. Again, I'm not making a robust case for it, and I'm sure that someone could easily pick some holes in it. So if that's you and you are either knowledgeable on the topic or this sparks some thought, I would appreciate you leaving some comments of what you think. But all that said, they talk about the soul for a little bit, its pre-existence, its immortality, and then we move back to the subject of virtue, and it seems like we're making some progress, because where with Euthyphro it kind of dies at the question asked about, is piety the way that it is because the gods love it, or do the gods love it because it's piety? We get to this point where Socrates kind of says that virtue is wisdom or knowledge. But then we run into the issue that you can teach things in knowledge. Again, I'm using that word, even though he just denied that things were taught. But you can kind of help somebody along in learning or understanding. But both parties seem to be very agreed that you can't do that with virtue. And they say that because there's just so many people that were virtuous. And by being virtuous, one of the things in that should include the fact that they see the value in virtue and they would want to teach to their kids, but yet their kids are not virtuous. So that actually leads to what I think is a very interesting thought. Socrates draws a distinction between knowledge and right opinion, and saying that if you have knowledge of something, you know you're right. If you have right opinion of something, you are equally as right as if you're knowledgeable on it, but you just have no true way of knowing that it's right when you're defending it or explaining it. And what this does to me is it kind of allows virtue to be kind of in the same circle as knowledge, but without the surety, so you can't teach it, because you can't really necessarily teach somebody an opinion. By definition, that's based off of a lack of knowledge somewhere, but you can still be right in your opinion. Socrates said, then true opinion is as good a guide to correct action as knowledge, and that was the point which we omitted in our speculation about the nature of virtue when we said that knowledge only is the guide of right action, whereas there is also right opinion. And this distinction is important, and it kind of helps them understand why maybe somebody might be virtuous but is unable to teach their kid to do so. Socrates then says, but if not by knowledge, the only alternative which remains is that the statesman must have guided states by right opinion, which is in politics what divination is in religion. For diviners and also prophets may say many things truly, but they know not what they say. And Meno says, so I believe. And Socrates responds, and may we not, Meno, truly call those men divine who have no understanding, yet succeed in many, in grand deed and word. I talked about it either in the intro or in Euthyphro, I forget which, I think it was the intro, about kind of this natural revelation versus special, meaning like things that you observe and things that you are told, whereas the Bible is like a special divine revelation of divine truth, as opposed to just seeing out in nature how things generally work. Those are two things, and I think that kind of applies to this difference in right opinion and knowledge. As Christians, we can have knowledge of truth through special revelation. One might even call us diviners because we have divine revelation in the Bible. Whereas I think somebody like Plato and Socrates, in many places, are simply of right opinion. They don't know why they're knowledgeable, especially Socrates in this. I haven't read all Plato's work, so I don't want to speak on it. But Socrates, at least in these dialogues, is a man that seems to, in many ways, be of right opinion, but of no factual knowledge in the area of what virtue means. And to me, that's just so interesting, because it's a really cool delineation to say that someone is still right and can continue to be right because of some instinct almost. And they can't really explain why, just like a diviner might not understand their prophetic understanding of the future. Like a lot of the prophets in the Old Testament didn't know exactly what God had planned, and even though they were told things, they didn't really fully understand the scope of what it was that they were seeing or foretelling. But yet they were still of right opinion on the things in which they spoke. So Again, this one is extremely similar to Euthyphro in that it focuses a lot on virtue, but I think that we do make some headway in here, and I do think he's right. I think that for the people that don't have special revelation, that are not Christians, you are able to have almost an instinctual feeling about what is right or wrong without knowledge. And that can kind of lead to people thinking that virtue is relative to each person, because one person might have the right view of virtue, or even a lot of people. Most people can agree murdering is wrong. So what, do they know that by some factual basis of divine revelation? No. There's a right opinion that is just very easy for them to observe in that. So yeah, the last one we're moving to is Phaedo, though. So that one's up next. All right, so Phaedo is the last dialogue that we're going to be covering in this video. As I had mentioned, this one is one that we briefly talk about suicide. But the other thing that is talked about here is the eternality of the soul. So the setting here is, again, after the trial, and he's actually about to die, Socrates is. So it's either like the coming days or hours before his death. And the reason we're going to talk about suicide is because the means in which he is to die is self-administered poison. So they're going to give him a poison, he's going to drink it, and it's going to kill him. So immediately the question of, like, what do you think about suicide kind of pops up. And Socrates right away is against it. He believes that it is defying the gods to commit suicide. And I'm going to give you two quotes that he lays out. One says, "There is a doctrine whispered in secret that man is a prisoner who has no right to open the door and run away. This is a great mystery which I do not quite understand, yet I too believe that the gods are our guardians and that we are a possession of theirs." Second quote here is, "Then if we look at the matter thus, there may be reason in saying that man should wait and not take his own life until God summons him, as he is now summoning me." Now, I would say that this is a Christian view of suicide. And before I say anything more, I want to lay out, we cannot know everyone's fate. Just as someone that's a murderer, we cannot say surely that they never are going to be, they're not going to be with the Lord. We don't know people's hearts. We don't know situations. It's not our job to speak on individual salvations of people, but we can say as a broad stroke, that suicide is contrary to Christian ethics, morals, teachings, etc. And I think for a lot of the same reasons that Socrates does. This one Socrates doesn't mention, but we are image bearers. And it, just as murdering someone is wrong because it is destruction to the image of God, same with murdering yourself. I mean, suicide is just the murder of yourself. You're made in God's image. Therefore, even if you do nothing else, you have inherent value because you're made in God's image. So you don't have the right to destroy God's image in you. Number two, I think that suicide seems to be, by definition almost, a lack of faith in God. And his control plan, whatever you want to call it, it's a lack of faith in that. So whether it's you're not trusting him, you're losing hope, there's just something that is almost inherently against the gospel, putting your faith in Christ for your life, for your actions, for provision, whatever it may be, that, again, I'm not saying everyone that commits suicide, because we can have faith so much and then have one little slip up and someone decides, I don't want to get into the nitty gritty, but in general, it is a lack of faith or hope in Christ. The last thing, we do not belong to ourselves. And this is the point that I think Socrates is trying to make. But it's like, my life is not my own. My life belongs to Christ. We don't have the right to take our own lives. Aside from the image of God thing, if we're in Christ, we live for him, and he lives in us. So we don't get to play God and decide, I've lived enough, I don't want to be alive anymore, the burdens are too much. Like, we can be sympathetic with people. I don't want to make this emotional. I just want to try to be objective in this, that we don't get to play God and decide when we die. We don't have the wisdom, we don't have the knowledge, we don't know when the best time is for us to go. So for those reasons, suicide is wrong for the Christian, and I think that in some ways Socrates does recognize that it's wrong as well for similar reasons. We're moving on past suicide. I don't think we're going to talk about it for the rest of the video. The conversation moves on to afterlife, the soul. As in some of the other dialogues, Socrates is optimistic that after he dies, he will face a better life. Like what comes after death is better for him than currently. When they're talking with him about why he has this belief, he kind of is like, wouldn't it be ironic if I was afraid of death? A philosopher almost inherently is practicing the art of dying, in which we neglect ourselves. We don't, we're always looking forward to death because we're trying to almost separate our soul from our flesh, and that way our soul can be pure, cleansed, wise, all these things, and we are not hindered by the flesh. He just talks about how sometimes it gets in the way, the flesh does, and it distracts us. And they have some back and forth on this topic, but he does reiterate this idea of wishing or trying to attempt to sever a soul from his body, not in like a weird, evil way, but almost how we try to kill out our flesh. Not that our flesh is inherently wrong. I should actually lay this out. We need to be careful not to dip into Gnosticism. And there are many hallmarks of Gnosticism, one of them being that flesh and all things created are inherently evil and all spiritual things are good. This may be where some of Socrates' thoughts end up going to. That is not a Christian thought. Our flesh, since the fall, is weak, and it has proclivities towards things that are bad. But the flesh itself is not evil. Christ came in the flesh, so flesh can't be evil, otherwise he would be. And as part of the promise of Christ raising from the dead, we know that our bodies also will raise, and they'll be glorified bodies. But flesh, nonetheless, we're not going to cease being human after all is said and done, and we die, and there's judgment and resurrection. It's not just our souls. So we do need to be careful of that, but we need to tame and beat our flesh into submission, as Paul says. These are things that are also important for Socrates, and he thinks that not only is it important because there's certain bad vices and whatnot, but he would say that in order for the soul to gain wisdom, it needs to contemplate aside from these things of the flesh. He says, "Have we not found," they will say, "a path of thought which seems to bring us and our argument to the conclusion that while we are in the body and while the soul is infected with the evils of the body, our desire will not be satisfied, and our desire is of the truth. For the body is a source of endless trouble to us by reason of the mere requirement of food, and is liable also to diseases which overtake and impede us in the search after true being. It fills us full of loves and lusts and fears and fancies of all kinds, and endless foolery, and in fact, as men say, takes away from the power of thinking at all." So like that kind of encapsulates his idea that he kind of wishes he could sever himself as much as is realistically and humanly possible from his flesh so that he can focus on things above, which is a good lesson for us, I think. They do keep talking about the soul's immortality because while Socrates seems sure, the people that he's talking about don't seem as sure as he is. So he tries to use some more natural examples to prove that the soul is immortal and that it will not just die and that this isn't the end. And he starts to work in a series of opposites. So like hot versus cold, visible versus the invisible. And I think what's important to tag in there is visible being things that are compound. That's kind of how he sees them. Like, wood is made of molecules that are compounded into things, whereas invisible things are by nature not compound and therefore eternal. And then life versus death. So he looks at these opposites and he says, things are always moving one towards another. If things are really hot, it can move towards cold gradually, but it cannot be hot and cold at the same time. And he says this to say, while we are alive, we are in the act of dying. And we eventually do die. But he says it can't end there, because once we're dying, then we will be in the act of living. And eventually, in his idea, we will be reborn. And there's some degree of reincarnation that he sees throughout his dialogues. But he also has a definite end afterlife that kind of everyone goes to. They have different places depending, different outcomes depending on your life. But he makes these arguments for the immortality of the soul. And one of the other things that he does is he retouches on the whole idea that we talked about earlier about we don't actually learn things, we just recall them. Therefore, if we recall things, the soul had to be alive before to retain that knowledge and to hold on to it through human life to be recalled. He also says, and this is, I think, an important part that is kind of cool to me, is that he says that opposites cannot participate in one another. So, for example, the number 3 has the essence of 3, okay? Whatever that means. Yet it is an odd number as well. It participates in oddness. Even though it doesn't have the essence of oddness, since it participates in oddness, the number 3 can never be even. With that being said, he makes the argument that the soul, while not the essence of life, participates in life the same way that like the number 3 participates in oddness. Therefore, it can never be death. The soul can never die because it doesn't participate in death, it participates in life. And he gives a short description after that, of how he sees the afterlife. He kind of lays it out very similarly to I think how Christians do in some sense, where you do bad things, you go to a bad place, Tartarus. You do good things, you're purged and sanctified, which is an interesting topic for those that believe in purgatory. But you're purged in some way, and then you go into like a good place. And then there's like a middle ground for people that maybe did some pretty seriously bad things, but try to make up for it for the rest of their life. And in that sense, they do spend some time in the evil, like Tartarus kind of place. And then they need to receive forgiveness from whoever it was that they wronged. So yeah, I really can see a lot of similarities between Plato or Socrates' The Afterlife and the Christian one. I think some main differences do stick out. I would say that in general, the path to the afterlife is obviously different, as our belief is based on faith in Christ. So there's an element of faith and not such a strong emphasis on the works, although I don't want to exclude that as something that Christians should do. We should be operating in good works. But Socrates is almost like, you do bad things, you go bad place, it is kind of a good general rule of thumb, but there is a difference in how we get to the afterlife. Also, in Christianity, it is God that is our ultimate judge. It is Christ that judges us. And while seeking forgiveness from other people is important, it is not important to the degree that if we don't obtain forgiveness from them, we are going to be stuck in hell or something of this, something of the sort. All right, that is the last dialogue. I want to take a few minutes here and just reflect on what we've gone over, maybe hit on some topics that need emphasis, talk about how we can use this information to grow in our walk with God and grow spiritually. First, I do hope that you can see, just by how Plato and Socrates talk about virtue, character, the importance of the soul, whatnot, how this could translate into making Christianity more palatable for those that are pagan. Again, perhaps the Jews had a more clear path through the prophets, and they still had John the Baptist, who kind of paved the way for Christ. And while I don't want to compare these philosophers to John the Baptist in the same way, I think that there was sort of a preparing that was done maybe unintentionally. So I hope you can see that. Some of the things that I thought were some key takeaways. I have 5 points here. The first one being that that virtue, piety, morality, whatever you want to call it, is grounded in the essence and character of God. And I think this is a big takeaway because, like we talked about, how much relativity there is in the world. We can have surety in virtue that because it is standing on an unchanging foundation that is God, the character of God himself, therefore the essence of God. It is eternal. What was right for the very first person is still right for us now. And I want to remind people that with these things being rooted in the character of God, to kind of put an emphasis on how important it is when we I talked about how when we act virtuously, God sees us acting as he would, in a sense, obviously to different degrees, but also we are that way to other people. So what does it mean to act godly? Well, it's not just hitting a list of virtues, but to be godly is to take the place of God to other people to some degree. Like I said, we're never going to be all powerful. We're not going to save people because that's God's work. We can contribute to their salvation and maybe lead them on the right path. But for instance, when we provide food for people, we are acting like God because God provides for us. When we show love or hospitality to people, this is us being God to someone else in a small way. And so I think it's really important to have that focus that doing the right thing isn't just doing the right thing because we have to, but it's acting like God, and it encourages me to be more godly. Point number 2, evil is never permissible. And this is, again, I talked about this being kind of a hot topic and something that I do think Christianity needs a little bit more focus on. And I think it's really important because, as Plato had said, and he's correct, I think, there is no compromise or kind of seeing eye to eye with people that believe evil should never be done under any circumstance, and people that are willing to do evil for the sake of other goods or to diminish greater evils. So I just want to encourage people to really think about that. Think about how they make these decisions about whether or not small evils are fine. Do the ends justify the means? That sort of thought. And I don't want to condemn anyone or make them seem like they're way outside the scope of being saved because they might believe it. I want to encourage people to consider that they may be wrong there and that there's no permissible time to act evil, which, by the way, would be the opposite of virtue and therefore the opposite of acting like God. So it would be acting as the adversary, as Satan, in a small way, as opposed to being like God to somebody else. Number 3, the opinion of the masses is rarely correct. This is really important, and I think that we can easily understand why in Christianity this would be a focus. The road is narrow, not many, are on the right path. And I think that we need to be comfortable with the fact that, as a general rule of thumb, we will be the odd ones if we act godly and Christ-like. And I don't want to encourage people to try to be odd or to try to be against the popular opinion all the time and always against people just to be against them. But I think it's a safe rule of thumb to say that in general people are going to think you're weird or you're too religious, too far out, too whatever it is. And I want to encourage us to not feel pressured all the time when we disagree with what the general blanket opinion is, and to remember that we obey God, not man. I think that we should be seeking advice not from popular opinion, but from wise spiritual individuals, preferably like a pastor or somebody that has a track record of spiritual maturity. Number 4, we need to have a heavenly focus. This one is really important, and I think it really ties in with really all the other options, but Plato really through Socrates, focused on the fact that what we do in this life can either help us or harm us. It can damage our soul, or it can kind of lead us on to higher things. But also that his comfort in dying was because he knew that what was coming after was of benefit. And where I think he doesn't kind of go all the way that Christians would is that we know that the kingdom of heaven, we know exactly what it is, at least as far as we need to know. And I think something we need to focus on is acting godly, acting like we would in the kingdom of heaven, with the goal of bringing the kingdom of heaven down to earth. And I don't mean that in a hyper charismatic way in which, every single person that we see, we perform a miracle in front of them. I mean that to say we should be acting godly and striving to do his will, and as it is done in heaven, as the Lord's Prayer goes, And that way, when we interact with people, we are bringing the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God to them through our actions, our thought, and all the areas in which we have control over. So like as a parent, my family, especially my kids and my wife, these should be areas that I'm doing my best to facilitate and imbue with the kingdom of heaven so that my children are raised that way. My wife is uplifted and raised, not raised, but encouraged in that way. And that is the atmosphere for the areas in which I have control of and I can interact with. Number 5 would be our wisdom is folly. So the wisdom of man is nothing. God used not the wise, but the foolish to make fools of the wise. And so I think we would do well to remember that wisdom is found first in the fear of the Lord, and that we shouldn't use our own opinion to contradict what God has made clear. If you are wondering maybe more about wisdom, the book of Proverbs is a good place to go. I think a lot of people know that, but no matter how many times you've read it, I found that it's always instructive and edifying to my soul. So I would really encourage that. One verse that really sticks out to me in James, which James is kind of wisdom literature, James in the New Testament. A lot of people see it that way in that genre. But one of the things that I really like that kind of I see as linking with not following our own wisdom is James talks about how we shouldn't just go off to such and such city and say that we're going to make money and kind of bank all our future plans around what we think is going to work and what, trusting our own wisdom. But he says instead we should say, like, yeah, we will go out and do such and such should, if it's in God's will or should God allow. And we should submit all things unto Christ and just not become arrogant or puffed up. Pride is one of the major sins. Sometimes I think that all sins sort of revolve around pride in some way or another. Becoming arrogant, boastful, puffed up. The Bible talks about these things being bad so many times that it's hard to even count. So I want to encourage us to remain humble, to be patient with others that maybe aren't humble, and to be less maybe aggressive or assertive, especially when it comes to what we know and what we don't know. That's something that I'm working on all the time. And I just want to encourage other people to as well. And it's just easier when you sit back and look at the big picture and think, in the grand scheme of things, I actually know nothing. And what I do know, I don't know because of my own wisdom. It was just handed to me on a platter. That's all I have for this. I do want to talk very briefly because I'm going to shift a little bit. I recognize that this video might not tickle everyone's fancy. It probably takes a certain person that's interested in this topic. So if you watched it, thank you. I am going to be pivoting a little bit. So I'm not going to be continuing down this philosophy angle for the next handful of videos. I thought about it, but I'm actually going to move more into, well, probably most people are interested in, which would be more theological discussion, just more Christian, explicitly Christian content. What I'm going to talk about next will actually be about Christian authority. So Christian authority, as I had mentioned earlier in the video, is a very hotly debated topic as far as what is the Christian's authority. Is it scripture? Is it tradition? Is it a pope? Is it a bishop? Is it what is authority? So I'm going to talk a little bit about sola scriptura, which is the Christian view that scripture alone is our only infallible authority. And I'll define all that terminology for those that are not familiar in the next video. But I'll talk about that. I'm going to talk about the role of tradition. I'm going to talk about how different Christian traditions like Eastern Orthodox, Catholicism, and then even some differences in Protestantism and how authority is viewed, how tradition is viewed. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think might not be mentioned enough when talking about our authority, and that is having the importance of a base of knowledge before we start entering these discussions and making decisions on what faith traditions we should be choosing. So I'll talk about a handful of things, and this will lead into some other topics that I'm very passionate about as well. This is a topic I'm very interested in, but this will lead into some other videos about particularly like high church versus low church, which is something I'm very excited to talk about. And then different views and understandings, and I think the importance of the sacraments or the mysteries, those being, there's more than one sacrament, more than two really, but the predominant ones being the Eucharist or communion and baptism. So that's what I have planned for the next video. Is just going to be about authority, tradition, sola scriptura, and the importance of like a base of knowledge. And then the videos coming after, we'll be talking more about those sacraments and then high church versus low church. So I'm very excited. If you enjoyed the video, let me know. If there's a topic that you're interested in being covered, please also let me know. I am very open to sprinkling in things that viewers want to see here and there. And if you have any questions, put them in the comments. I'd love to interact. Thank you for watching. I will see you next week.